Hi, Kinesiology 3030. Welcome to our second shoulder joint lecture on the rotator cuff. So we're going to be a little bit more specific here with the rotator cuff. And we just went through our major extrinsic and our major intrinsic glenohumeral muscles. In this lecture, we're going to go into the four muscles that create the glenohumeral stability that our connective tissue and bony structure don't really allow for. And we'll discuss how that allows for greater glenohumeral mobility and how we can really work together to make these muscles function well, to have a safe and healthy shoulder, or how these muscles can really become injured or damaged or have issues where now our glenohumeral joint has maybe loss of mobility or loss of major stability or cause some form of injury because there is an issue with the rotator cuff. Okay, the first muscle in our rotator cuff is the subscapularis. Subscapularis is the anterior rotator cuff muscle. It has its origin on the subscapular fossa and then its insertion on the medial edge of the bicipital groove. So similar insertion site to latissimus dorsi and teres major are big internal rotators of the glenohumeral joint. Our subscapularis falls into that internal rotator category. Okay, so the functions here are internal rotation primarily. It can assist in some adduction, it can assist in some extension, but its primary goal is internal rotation and stabilization of the head of the humerus in the glenoid fossa. So all of these rotator cuff muscles have an insertion on closer to the proximal end of the humerus near the glenohumeral joint, because each of these rotator cuff muscles have a line of pull that pulls the humeral head directly into the glenoid fossa. So their stabilization is to pull that ball, that head of the humerus into the socket, the glenoid fossa, and hold it there. So they all have this line of pull directly through the center of the joint, not even causing any rotation, just causing a compression force to hold that joint together. So this is our anterior rotator cuff muscle, also one of our internal rotators in that internal rotator group. The next is supraspinatus. Supraspinatus is superior to the scapular spine. Supraspinatus, okay, superior to the spine of the scapula. And it has a line from the medial 2/3 of the supraspinous fossa to the greater tubercle superior on the humerus. So this is a superior muscle to the glenohumeral joint. It also runs just inferior to the acromioclavicular joint and right between the acromioclavicular joint and the humeral head, which puts it at a little bit of a risk. And we'll talk about that later, about how this kind of sliding through this little opening can put supraspinatus at a great risk for different injuries. Our actions here are assisting with abduction, especially initial abduction. That first kind of 15 degrees, we can get a good pull there when deltoid doesn't have a great line of pull, but it's also not a very strong position. And we are stabilizing the head of the humerus in the glenoid fossa, holding from a superior aspect. So you see how this muscle has a line of pull directly through the joint. Very little rotation can occur, especially if we're already in some form of abduction. We are only pulling the glenoid fossa tighter and tighter with the humeral head. We're just compressing that joint to hold stability. The next rotator cuff muscle is infraspinatus, which is just inferior to the spine of the scapula on the infraspinous fossa, and then an insertion posterior on the greater tubercle. So it's just inferior and posterior insertion site to supraspinatus. Unlike supraspinatus, there's a little bit more rotation that can occur from infraspinatus. Infraspinatus and our subscapularis kind of work in opposition to each other because infraspinatus causes external rotation horizontal abduction. It can assist in some extension, but it also works in that stabilization of the head in the glenoid fossa. So subscapularis and infraspinatus pull in opposition. One is posterior, one is anterior, to pull the humerus into the glenoid fossa and stabilize either end. So if the humerus translates anterior or it translates posterior, those muscles can stop that translation and really pull that joint back together. But infraspinatus also works into our external rotator group with teres minor, which has its origin on the lateral border of the scapula and insertion on the greater tubercle posterior. Similar insertion site to infraspinatus, but sits just inferior and lateral to infraspinatus. The actions here are external rotation, similar to infraspinatus. They work together as the two external rotators of the rotator cuff. They can cause some adduction from an abducted position, and assist in some horizontal abduction, some extension. So there's a few little minor movements. Teres minor is also just superior to teres major, but it also assists in really pulling the humerus inferior and into the glenoid fossa. So it has a little bit more of a superior to inferior insertion to origin, so it can pull the humerus down and it can hold it on the posterior aspect of the glenoid fossa. So these are our four rotator cuff muscles. So we have subscapularis, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. This is our SITS muscle group. SITS is how we can remember. Subscapularis, infraspinatus, teres minor, and supraspinatus. I say subscapularis. All four of our rotator cuff muscles. These all work to pull the humeral head into the glenoid fossa and create dynamic stability wherever the humerus is in space. So they are working there actively to hold that joint together. So here are some questions. We'll talk about these in lab. Make sure you have some kind of answer for them. So why is glenohumeral stability important, specifically from the rotator cuff? How does the rotator cuff influence mobility of the glenohumeral joint? What are some activities that require rotator cuff involvement? So going through that sports activities of daily living and exercises. Why might the rotator cuff suffer some injury? And how can the rotator cuff be strengthened? Okay, we'll talk a little bit more in lab about where are some actual activities that could be injury or cause injury to the glenohumeral joint and some of these activities, but I want you to go through these on your own before lab, and then we can start the discussion here. All right, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in lab.